this morning. We are starting yet another series in our year of 2025, and we should have already started this series, but we had some time off for weather. But what we're going to do every so often is we're going to take a look at family. And so when we look at family, we all have a family, even if it's not a traditional one. We come from somewhere. And all of us, to some extent, have to put up with a family. We have to manage with a family. And so we're going to take a look, as we start looking at this topic, at the very first family. Seems like an appropriate place to begin. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of positive lessons from the first family that we see. But to do that, of course, we're going to be at the very beginning. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 3, chapter 4. We're going to take a look there. And so we'll start out with a little bit of context. The context, there's not a whole lot, because there's not a whole lot before we see family introduced. And so God initially creates everything, but in that He creates man, and He creates woman, and so God has created family. And it was God's plan then from the very beginning. There was never a world in which God was going to create mankind and not institute family. It was always His plan, and the plan was a husband and a wife. The plan was, beyond that, children. And so children are going to add a whole new dynamic to that situation. But one thing that's interesting to think about, but also pitifully sad to think about, is that the fall of man, the first sin, takes place when Adam and Eve are the only people in existence. And so what that means is that there were never children introduced into the world before it was a world of sin. So every child that's been born into this world was born into a world full of sin, including Cain and Abel, who we'll talk about in this first family. We're pretty used to the process of family now. We know that people are going to get married, they're going to have children, and that's just how it is, at least most of the time. And that's part of God's plan, certainly. But this first family, it's not that it wasn't the plan, but it was a little bit different. There hadn't been a family. There hadn't been children. Now, God had commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, and so they understood that part of what family would look like, but this was all new to them, especially the idea of parenting. For us as parents, we kind of wonder what exactly our guide is, but how much more so when you're talking about Adam and Eve. They talked with God some. Hopefully God told them some of the things that they would need to know, but it's not like they had an example that they could follow. It's not like they could think, well, what did my parents do in this situation? So it was all new to them. That doesn't really give them a pass, but things aren't going to turn out very well for them. A couple other things as we give the background here. The timeline for these events is not very clear. And so we'll introduce a few things that we don't really know the exact timeline. All we can do is kind of speculate. The first thing that we don't really know is how long Adam and Eve were in the garden. Now, you could speculate any different number of lengths of time for how long they stayed in the garden, but if you think about it in terms of that they were humans and they gave in to the pressure of sin, how long do you think that took? Probably not that long. Well, I don't think we're talking years in the garden. I may be wrong there, but that's one thing we don't necessarily know. The second thing is we don't know how long it was after the being banished from the garden that they had Cain and Abel. We're not really told that. But as we said, God had already given them the command to be fruitful and multiply. So it probably isn't going to take that long. It may be a few years, but that process is going to start pretty soon after, we would imagine. And then we also don't really know the age that Cain and Abel are whenever we're introduced to them. But it would seem that they're not toddlers and they're not young children, because they are taking care of livestock, and beyond that, they're also planting crops and harvesting them. So they appear to be, at least, this is kind of silly to even say, teenagers or young men. But of course, given the lifespans that we're talking about at this time, what does that really even look like? So all of those things, it's kind of hard to say, but it places us somewhere in the time that we're supposed to be in here. So we look at this first family, and what do we see? Well, again, there's not a whole lot of positives. And in this family, we start with the first two members of the family, of Adam and Eve. The first interaction that we really get between them as husband and wife is a negative one. And so the interaction that we probably think to first is the sin that takes place. And so why is it that Adam eats the fruit from the tree? Because he was influenced by his wife. There's truth to that. There's also truth to her later saying that she was influenced by the serpent. So there's truth there. But what we see then is that even from the beginning, there's the potential for family to negatively influence other members of the family. And we experience that. We know about that. It's nothing new. And really most everything that happens here is nothing new. But a spouse in particular has and should have, according to God's idea of family, they should have more influence on you than anyone else in the world. That could be a good thing, it could be a wonderful thing, or that could be a terrible thing, depending on what situation you're in. And so part of this would be a lesson in saying, obviously this is an important choice because the person that you are married to is going to have a lot of influence. The other side of that is, if you're married or if you're looking to be married, then what kind of influence are you? And what kind of influence do you seek to be? Still just talking about Adam and Eve, though, as spouses, when they are caught in sin, as you'll remember the story goes, what is their initial response? And we've already mentioned it, but when Adam is questioned, he says in chapter 3, verse 12, "Well, the woman who you gave to be with me," that's how his answer begins. Not, "This is my fault, not I've done anything wrong," but instead, "Well, this was the influence that led me to this." Is that true to an extent? Sure. But is it Adam's decision? Of course. And the same thing happens with Eve. She doesn't blame Adam, but she blames the serpent and says, "Well, the serpent's the one that told me." So the initial example that's set here is that we blame other people. And again, we're familiar with that, right? And in this case, Adam is going to blame his spouse. So again, nothing new, nothing too surprising there. But that doesn't make it right just because he does that. So they already are blaming other people for their mistakes. And we'll see that come back up in just a minute. Then we introduce the two brothers in chapter 4. And we have Cain and we have Abel. And we know about their story, hopefully, that one of them is a keeper of the sheep, one of them tends the ground. And then verse 4, the Lord respected Abel's offering. Verse 5, he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So when we start to look at these brothers, we see that they are in competition. There's a little bit of jealousy between them. And yet again, there's nothing new under the sun. In fact, probably most siblings have some degree of this kind of rivalry. And it may even be a normal behavior, but it also has to be managed. Because if it's not, then bad things can result pretty quickly. And obviously the results here are going to be bad as well. But when we see Cain in verse 5 there getting angry, he gets angry. We get angry. Anger is something that is natural to humans. The question is, what do you do after the anger comes? Once the emotion's there, then what? And God gives him the opportunity. He essentially says that, okay, you're angry, now what? What are you going to do? You have the opportunity to do something better, or you have the opportunity to allow sin to creep up and to help you make a decision that you can't unmake. And so in verse 9, it says, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother?' Cain said, 'I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?'" So he's angry. He does sin. When he sins, he kills his brother. God comes and asks him, "What happened?" He says, "Oh, I don't know. Am I supposed to be watching out for him?" What he does is quite similar to what we've already seen. He says, I don't know. That's not my problem. It's somebody else's responsibility. It's someone else's fault. And so he has learned this lesson, and where do you think he learned that lesson from? To not respond directly to God, first off, and also to respond by saying, I don't know, it's somebody else's responsibility. He's learned that from his parents, the only people he could have learned that from. And so we set an example as parents, and we set an example whether we want to or not. And so our children are going to pick up, especially on actions and on the things that we say. And it may be that he remembered the story of how his own parents had sinned against God and the way that they tried to get away with it. He thought, maybe that'll work out for me. Doesn't work out too well, but he does try. In verse 13 of Genesis chapter 4, it says, "And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear." This is in response to God saying in the previous verses that he is going to be cursed because he has killed his brother. He's going to be a fugitive on the earth. He's never going to really have a home. And so Cain, instead of saying, you know what, I killed my brother, that's pretty bad. Instead, Cain says, I can't bear it. This is too much for me. In spite of his brother now being dead, he says, boy, I have to deal with this now. It's just too much for me. And so we go back to the same mentality that we've seen through Adam and Eve already and in Cain already, that Cain is playing the victim again. And he says, I know that here are my actions over here, but what's that have to do with how I'm being treated now? It's unfair. I'm a victim of God's judgment now, in spite of doing very little wrong, just killing my brother. And so he once again follows this same pattern. And so this is the pattern that we see in this first family. And there's a couple of sad truths that come along with this. If our timeline's anywhere close to right, we're talking maybe 20 years or less from the time that God creates the world and creates the first home until that first home is broken. We still have Adam and Eve, and they'll have more children, but where's the rest of that family? One's already deceased, and one is never to be seen again. As far as we know, Cain may never see his family again. And so that is a tragic warning to us of how quickly things can happen, how quickly we can go from God's plan to our own plan to something that doesn't look anything like what God had intended. Along with this, you think about the person who was responsible initially for causing this temptation. And you look at Satan and what he does after the world is created. God creates the world, and what does Satan go after first? The first thing he goes after is a marriage, and the second thing he goes after is the whole family. Has that changed? Or does Satan still attempt the same temptations to marriage, to the family that he always has? Satan knows that if God thought that this was a good plan, that all he needs to do is to try to mess it up. And he's been trying to do that ever since the beginning. So we look at this family, we look at Adam and Eve, we look at Cain and Abel, and we kind of ask this question, well, what went wrong? And the sad part is that it wasn't anything new. It wasn't anything different than we experience today. It was kind of just humans being humans. And unfortunately, that doesn't go very well most of the time. They were humans that gave in to peer pressure. They were influenced by one another. They were humans that were selfish. That's not too surprising. They were a family that were victimized, or they treated themselves that way. They were people who didn't deal very well with their own emotions and never dealt with them in a healthy way. And so it's a lot of the same problems that affect us today, but we get to look at them and say, we at least have one advantage over them. It's kind of a strange way of looking at it, but even though they could talk to God in some kind of physical way, that his presence was there in the garden with them, we have the advantage over them because all they had revealed was what God had told them in person, but we have everything that God desires for us to know written out if we're willing to listen to it. God has given us something that tells us how to be a family. He's written something for us that tells us how to love one another, that tells us that there's an example that we can imitate if we want to be a better member of a family. Not only that, but you think, yes, God had just created them, but they didn't have the advantage of knowing Christ and seeing his example of what love could look like. And so we do have the advantage there. But a few specific lessons that we can take from this family. The first thing is that we as families have to learn personally and then have to teach our other members of the family how to deal with emotion. Because emotions are always going to come up. And you won't see that by name in Scripture. It won't say, you need to be able to manage your emotions. It's kind of a modern way of saying it, but you'll see talk about self-control. You'll hear that from Christ. You'll hear that in the book of Proverbs. You'll see it again and again, because self-control, which is really just what do you do once those emotions come in, that self-control is what changes the whole situation. And again, it has to be taught generation after generation. Along with that, I think a lesson you can probably take from this is when you're teaching children, don't sugarcoat what the world is like. And there's a certain amount to which we want to protect children from the things that go on in the world, and there's a line to be drawn there, so don't get me wrong. But at the same time, as far as generalizing life, what should children know about life? Should they think that it's going to be easy? That's not going to help them. Should they know instead that it's going to be difficult, that there's going to be challenges, there's going to be emotions that come up, and then when those things do come up, they can be a little bit better prepared for that, because life can be hard. And like we talked about between brothers even, children should know life is not equal. Life is not fair. If people are going to be better at things than you are, you're going to be treated unfairly sometimes, but you're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to deal with disappointment. Cain didn't seem to be very aware of that. And so his response is, unfortunately, a pretty negative one. Another lesson to take along with this is more for the parents, I suppose, but anyone who is watching what a family does, don't ignore red flags. The reason I can say that from what we've talked about today is because we can ask this question and give a pretty obvious answer. Do you think that Adam and Eve had ever seen any anger issues from Cain before the day that Abel died? Or do you think that that was the first time that he had ever had any problem lashing out with anger? Does that happen? Do people kill people without some history of not dealing well with other problems in their life? And so don't ignore that. Whenever somebody's unable to deal with whatever life hands them, it probably means that sometimes something's going to come up that overwhelms them to the point that something even worse may happen. But maybe all of this can kind of be summarized by saying that in family or in life in general, one of the principles to learn from the first family that we see in Scripture is to take responsibility for yourself. Would these chapters look different in the book of Genesis? Would the results for humanity maybe even be different if each person in this story takes responsibility for their action? Now, I don't know what it would have done different if whenever God comes to Adam, if he'd said, you know what, I have messed up. I have made a mistake. I have allowed myself to be influenced. I should have, as the leader of this family, done something better. I should have set the tone, and I didn't. God still probably kicks them out of the garden. They're probably still cursed, but does it change the story? It really does. What if Eve does the same thing, and really what if Cain says, you know what, God? I could have offered a better sacrifice. I could have, and next time I will. Then what happens? The story is changed again. But one other lesson, on a positive note, when it comes to family, is that whatever mistakes that we've already made, because we have all already made mistakes, that the story of a family is not finished until, I guess it's not over until it's over. And so we look at this family and we say, okay, we go back to this in Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. It says, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. So there's another child born. Verse 26, and as for Seth, to him also was born another son named Enosh, and then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Skip down to chapter 5, verse 4. It says, after he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. We know what happened with the first part of this family, but there's a lot more to their story that we don't know. We do know that they had a lot of other sons and daughters, and we know that they had Seth, and we know that men started to worship God shortly after that time, after Seth had his child. And so things aren't all downhill from the first family. It's a set of choices, and you get to see as you get to different forks in the road what happens with this family. The children of Cain get even worse. The children of Seth do even better. And eventually, through the children of Seth, God would send one child into the world that would save every other. This morning, we have the opportunity as members of a family to be better than we've been before. We have the opportunity to be corrected as Cain was, but to make a better decision. We have the opportunity to lead our families closer to God. We have the opportunity to not give up on our family. And we have the opportunity also to join into the family of God. That family is also not perfect because it's made up of humans, but it's a family that's at least trying to serve God. And this morning, if you need to be added to that family, we'd love to talk to you about that. If there's any other need that you have, we ask that you come now as we stand, as we sing.
Just get through it. See you.